Thanks for pressing play on another Dolphins podcast. Today is dedicated to first round draft prospects, so that can only mean one thing. Both Houtz and Kat are joining me to break down 7. Yes, I said 7 options the Miami Dolphins should consider at pick 13. But before we jump in, Kat, let's set the groundwork. Let's lay it straight. How did you kind of formulate things? How are we going to be approaching today's podcast?
So the Dolphins have the 13th pick in the draft, right? And I'm axing off, so it doesn't monopolize the conversation, I'm axing off 6 players, okay? They are guys that are not going to be there at pick number 13, okay? So 3 of them are very obvious at the top. Defensive end, Abdul Carter from Penn State. Cornerback, wide receiver, Travis Hunter from Colorado. Defensive tackle, Mason Graham from Michigan. Both quarterbacks, Cam Ward from Miami and Shadir Sanders from Colorado. And also, too, Tet McMillan from Arizona. I don't see any way he gets to pick number 13, even if he runs slow. So those 6 guys axed, and we'll pick up from there.
Joshua Houtz, it's good to see you. I've seen you on Blue Sky talking a little Grand Theft Auto lately, so you get those criminal vibes out of your system.
Yeah, man, I was just saying how we need Grand Theft Auto ASAP so people wouldn't just rage in a video game or something. But, dude, I'm glad to be back on here with you and Kat. You guys held down the fort a little bit while I was sick or, busy doing other things. So excited to jump into the draft because, as we all know, the Combine's quickly approaching. And like Kat said, the 13th overall pick stares the Dolphins and Chris Grier directly in the face.
I'm holding a 7-card hand right now. I have 7 players right here, and I'm just trying to figure out where I want to go. Kat, the Dolphins made some moves recently. They released 3 players in order to it seemed like cap salary creating type of moves. So as a result, the Dolphins have voids now at running back. They released Raheem Mostert. Cornerback, they released Kendall Fuller. And even tight end, Durham Smythe was released. I want to start Michigan. Will Johnson. We know how much Chris Grier loves his quarterbacks. What's the chance you see someone like Will Johnson fitting in with this Miami Dolphin defense?
So on my top 7 list, he's number 2. And this is a very zone-heavy cornerback. Okay, 6'2", 202 pounds. And unfortunately, he missed most of the season with an injury, but it was a turf toe. So look, it's not the same as tearing a ligament, tearing an ACL, tearing an Achilles. He had turf toe. So he's expected to make, obviously, a full recovery and be back. When I look at him, I see unbelievable instincts. He's somebody that, even though he played 6 games, had 3 interceptions, 2 back to the house. And you put him opposite Jalen Ramsey, and now you can kick Kader Kohu on the into the inside. You've got a heck of a 3-man tandem there at the cornerback spot.
Yeah, and that's not a bad problem to have, right? I know I did a write-up for the Finsider recently. The Athletic beat writers actually came together and did a mock draft, and they actually had the Dolphins getting Will Johnson at 13. And the biggest thing that sticks out to me is I remember writing an article for Operation Sports where I went through and, tried to grade the highest players at each position, and I had Travis Hunter at cornerback, and a lot of people were like, whoa. Will Johnson, man, you got to go watch him because he's the truth. And the guy is incredible. I think I agree with you, Kat, that putting him opposite of Jalen Ramsey, then moving Kader Kohu inside, that would be convenient for the Dolphins. And I always look at the Michigan ties, right? I mean, we saw Stephen Ross, he took Jim Harbaugh, or was it John? I always get him mixed up, but he took Harbaugh there to Michigan over the Miami Dolphins. He loves Michigan. For him to get a chance to have a blue chip player that would fall into his lap like Will Johnson. Again, I kind of think this 13th overall pick is almost going to, make life easier for Chris Grier. An elite player might fall in their lap. And for me, I think we've been talking about it for a few weeks now. Will Johnson would be that guy.
And to piggyback on that and to answer Jake's question, which I rarely do, do I think Will Johnson will be there? If he runs slower than a 4.45, I think he will be there. Now, you may say, okay, that devalues him as a prospect, but when you look at the Dolphins playing a lot more zone than other teams in the league compared to, a Brian Flores type of defense from a couple of years ago, that makes not running in the 4.3s a little bit more not such a big deal.
You don't need that like makeup speed as often. Obviously, there will still be times you're playing in man, but I'm picking up what you're putting down. He was the defensive MVP of the 2023 National Championship game. He only turns 22 next month. He entered 2024 as the highest rated cornerback. And above all else, I look back to last year, and I don't want this to come off as shade, but the Miami Dolphins moved on from Xavier Howard, and they signed Kendall Fuller to come in, and everyone was under the impression you want someone a little more durable. That's why you're bringing Kendall Fuller, who dealt with his own injuries. So when you're looking at this Miami Dolphins team and you're looking about kind of resetting the secondary, Kat, you mentioned it in a previous show. Maybe you sign a couple of free agent safeties and kind of go like that. You are going to need youth in this unit. You are going to need to start looking towards the future. Someone like Will Johnson, I feel, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, Kat. Not only is this someone who's stepping in this year, but you're telling me he can learn from Jalen Ramsey, someone who we kind of have a feeling might move to safety in a couple of years. I think you're setting up the secondary not only for this year, but to kind of have sustained success.
Yeah, I agree. You could have Kader Kohu and Will Johnson on the outside, kick Jalen Ramsey into the slot, move him to safety in a couple of years if he stays around long term. It does give you a lot of options. As far as immediate need is concerned, in this division, if you're going to have a chance of doing anything, you have to beat Josh Allen. Best way to beat Josh Allen is to have three cornerbacks like that.
Pro Football Focus currently has him as their 13th overall player. Where's he ranked on your big board? I know you compile a bunch of them and kind of make up this awesome average of the means. Where's Will Johnson ranked on that list?
So on the consensus big board, which is pulling together like 7 different big boards updated over the last couple of weeks, so make sure they're current, Will Johnson is 6th. But I'll also say, too, that the difference between 6 and 12 is very, very small. So he has a good chance to be there. I mean, it really depends on what he runs in the 40-yard dash and his other athletic testings as draft day approaches.
I think I'm going to flip back and forth here going offense, defense. Kat, somebody who I love when you show your passion. I always go back to draft night with Chop Robinson. Armand Membou. I've been reading a lot about this guy, and turns 21 next month. Kind of gives me young Austin Jackson vibes, just because there are a couple of traits here. I'm not comparing them in terms of style, but there are these traits you love, but he's also a little bit younger. He seems like a very polarizing player. I've seen people like you love him, and then others on the fin side or wherever it may be been like, oh my God, why would they ever do this? Middle, late of the first, something like that. So I know you love him, but what do you think makes him such a polarizing or challenging player where some people might kind of get a little queasy talking about him?
Well, yeah, to say I love him is an understatement. He's number 1 for me on this list.
I love it.
Number 1 is Membou. Number 2 is Will Johnson. We can get to the others later. But you're talking about somebody who is going to be 6'3.5", 6'4", 340 pounds. He's going to be barely 21 on draft night. But what I like most about him, too, he gives me the vibe of I'll give a comparison that Lance Zierlein made from NFL.com, and that's Zach Tom, the right tackle from the Packers. He gives me those vibes, but also, too, you remember Tyler Smith a couple of years ago, the Cowboys drafted him 23rd overall, was a big, giant offensive tackle, 340 pounds. You saw the play strength. He just had to correct a lot of fundamentals in his game. But everything I see with Membou is easily correctable on tape. And because of that, I think when you've got the raw power, the raw skills, he projects very well as a right tackle or as a guard. And somebody who, even though he's 6'3.5", is expected to come in with over 34-inch arms. So he definitely exceeds that 33-inch arm threshold. So other than him being, a right tackle / guard, I don't see many flaws in him as a prospect heading into the 2025 draft.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong. He's the one that I see all these highlights of just burying dudes, right? He's the guy that, he's an absolute behemoth. I wanted to ask you, would you, you draft him, you still have Patrick Paul, or Teron Armstead's still hanging around. You have Austin Jackson. You would want to move Membou inside, or would you? I've seen people, maybe even discuss moving Austin Jackson to guard. Which one? In that situation, Membou at guard, or would you potentially play him at tackle?
I'd say Membou at guard to begin with, but that's the beauty of the pick too, is that he gives you a lot of that flexibility. I mean, remember Robert Hunt played right tackle for the Dolphins. He played right guard, and we were happy with him at both positions. He was better as a guard than a tackle, but I think Membou is going to be that same guy. The difference with him and Austin Jackson was 20 when he was drafted, and I think he is much, much further along than Austin Jackson was.
And Austin Jackson, I think he was like the sixth offensive tackle, like on most people's big boards too. It kind of like, we had some fears like last year when Chop Robinson was like the fifth defensive end. You're wondering like, oh God, is Chris Greer just trying to like chase his tail here, try to get that last guy before the run ends? But no, I completely see what you're saying. I wanted to just mention this because I think it's some good context. Robert Hunt, and if you look back to 2023, I always look at the Dallas Cowboys game just because Robert Hunt was celebrating so often because the Dolphins were ground and pounding with Jeff Wilson and it was working well. Robert Hunt, 6'6", 324 pounds. Membou, 6'3", 332 pounds. The best line I read about him was just the trait composed quickness. The Dolphins can't just have a bunch of massive offensive linemen. I just said Robert Hunt 6'6", but his highlights were when he was in the second level, third level, just devouring safeties, outside linebackers, and Membou kind of has those traits. So I absolutely can see this pick. Let's go back to the defensive side of the football. Guys, what could a Butkus Award winner like Jaylen Walker do to this Dolphins defense at pick 13?
So he is my only defensive player in my, he and Will Johnson are the only defensive players in my top 7 here. And I know a lot of people's remotes would go through the TV if Jaylen Walker was that pick because it's another edge pick.
Really?
Well, the reason is because of the position he plays. He's an edge guy. Yes, he shows the ability to play inside linebacker too, but I don't think that's why you draft him. You draft him if you believe what I do, that he's going to be an elite edge rusher. And somebody, with he and Chop Robinson being 22 and 23, for them to be your bookend tandem over the next couple of years, for the next 5 to 7 years, is massive. And it also gives you flexibility with Jalen Phillips and with Bradley Chubb. You can cut Bradley Chubb and save a lot of money. Jalen Phillips, I want him to be here long term, but the reality is, you just look at the last 5 or 6 years. You've got a year out of football with the concussions, and you've got 2 season-ending knee injuries. So you can't necessarily depend on him regardless of how he plays this year. But anyway, getting back to Jaylen Walker, 6.5 sacks this past year, which isn't a high number, but also keep in mind with the style of defense Georgia plays, a lot of players on that defense don't get sacks. In fact, just going back, only one player since 2018 has had more than 6.5 sacks in a season for Georgia, and that's Azeez Ojulari back in 2021. So I think he's going to throttle down and get to the quarterback, has nasty, violent hands, and I view him overall as a top 5 player in this draft, regardless of position.
Wow, that's high praise. I think the biggest thing was, and you kind of touched on it, a lot of scouts, or at least from what I've seen, some say he can play off-ball linebacker. Some have him at edge and think that's where he's going to be most productive. For me, I think a player like him, you bring him in, you hope that Anthony Weaver can, have a little bit of creativity, right? We've seen Chop Robinson before line up over center. You have all these moving pieces that obviously you want him on the edge. You want him just rearing back and going after quarterbacks. But if you can drop him back and let him play linebacker as well, a pick there at 13, if a player like he falls, I could absolutely see why the Dolphins would run into the board. Is there some traits that you like more that would have him playing on the edge as opposed to linebacker?
Yeah, I think he can turn the edge very, very well for being 245 pounds. A lot of those bigger players kind of square up when they try to turn around the corner. Not this guy. I think he can also, in terms of coverage, I'm attracted that he can cover very well out in the flats too. That's something very good. And now, look, he can play inside linebacker, but I don't think that's the reason you draft him. And he's you want to talk about, you use the word polarizing. Dane Brugler, who's my favorite draft, Nick, has him as the 3rd overall player on his big board. PFF has him as their 52nd the last time I checked. So you want to talk about a big disparity, that's that. This is a kind of a projection pick as well, because he did only have 6.5 sacks and 11 tackles for loss last year. But with a guy like this, I'm willing to take that leap.
So you don't draft him to play inside linebacker, but Where my intrigue comes from, and I don't want to make the argument here that you'd keep Chubb and Phillips along with these guys because I don't think you would. A whopping 2 pass breakups last year. But I look at the division. You have Josh Allen, and I don't want to compare Drake May to Josh Allen, but I look at the body type. And I just see the physical, the nasty of Jaylen Walker. And when you can add that versatility to whether it be go out in the flat when you have to tackle Josh Allen when he's escaping 25 seconds somehow into a play, different scenarios like that, I think the Dolphins should truly try to consider. You're in a division with Josh Allen. Drake May has those traits. What are the Jets going to do? I think you really need to focus on making sure that pass rush can do what's needed and that front seven isn't just going to be helpless, twice a year.
And Daniel Jeremiah just said, too, when he was talking to the media, he had his media segment, he expects him to run in the 4.4s. And so if you've got Chop Robinson and Jaylen Walker on the edge running in the 4.4s, chasing down Josh Allen in the open field, that's a major that's huge going up against Josh Allen. And to be clear as well, when it comes to Jaylen Walker, if the Dolphins were to take him at 13, it would be a value pick. It would be, this is the best player on the board at this spot. Nobody else comes close.
And I got to be honest, after watching the Super Bowl, I mean, I know a lot of fans might not want a pass rusher and things like that, but I mean, we saw it firsthand what it did to the Kansas City Chiefs. So pass rusher here, obviously, maybe not the sexiest pick, but a guy like Jaylen Walker, I mean, it kind of makes you excited to think of what Anthony Weaver and some of that what he could do with these other playmakers, like you mentioned, Chop Robinson and company.
So much is going to change in the next 2 months before the draft. So much is going to change, and I can't state that enough. But, Kat, with what we know right now, final question on Walker. What pick would we have to get to on draft night before you start sweating? Like, oh, he's still on the board. Oh, this might actually happen. Are we thinking like pick 8?
It's hard to say because he could really go anywhere. I mean, look, I think, too, that he's not somebody that I'm going to look at and say, oh, my gosh, he needs to fall down to this spot. Like, there were a handful of players last year, like Quinyon Mitchell, like Chop Robinson, like Troy Fautanu, that I felt that way about. This would be like, man, edge is not a need for the Dolphins right now, but we don't have another choice. So it would strictly be a stay at 13, take the best player available, which is what the Dolphins should always be doing.
Moving on, this is the first player not a lot of brain power went into it. I'm like, all right, this makes sense. Let's send it in. Real surface level, but Kelvin Banks, Texas junior, 6'4", 320 pounds. People are saying he can play guard or tackle. Kat, when you're an All-American as a freshman in 2022, got to be feeling pretty good about that as a prospect.
Yeah, I remember he went up against Will Anderson when he was a freshman at Texas and won that battle, which is a pretty good start to your career. And I believe that if Kelvin Banks were an inch taller, 10 pounds heavier, and a little bit more filled out, I think he'd be the number 1 pick in the draft. Mm-hmm. Because to me, he reminds me a lot of Laramie Tunsil, except just kind of smaller and not quite as dynamic in every area. But you take a look at his production. I mean, a guy that has 2,400 plus snaps in his career, and over the last 2 years, almost 900 snaps, and has only allowed 2 sacks and 9 pressures at the left tackle spot, playing really good competition. And I think this is somebody who translates very, very easily to the left guard spot. A lot better, in my opinion, than Will Campbell, because he can get lower and he can use his hips and his explosiveness a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of sold on Kelvin Banks Jr. I think he was one of the first mock drafts, I ever wrote up. But, I mean, I was a little bit sold on him before we even came on here based on, his production, like you mentioned, 935 snaps. He finished 11th out of 643 tackles, according to Pro Football Focus. So this is a guy who has just been consistent there with Texas. And like you said, I mean, as soon as you said Laramie Tunsil, I mean, that was game over for me. So I admit that I'm not the most knowledgeable when it comes to the offensive line, but I'm excited for, honestly, any of these guys if the Dolphins can, get the most out of them. Because like you said, man, if this guy was a little bit bigger, a little bit more filled out, he could potentially be, a top 3, top 1 pick. And that's saying everything.
Kat, can you explain this to me? Sorry if this is kind of putting you on the spot. So Kelvin Banks won the Outland Trophy, which is given to the best guard in the country. And I went through the best guards in the country. There were defensive tackles on that list. There were centers on that list. And the last 3 tackles to win the Outland Trophy, it was Banks, It was Penei Sewell and Alex Leatherwood. So, I mean, I thought that in itself was pretty interesting and a pretty solid indicator that, like, if you wanted to really shore up that offensive line and not have to think about one position for at least 2-3 years, Banks seems a little legit.
Yeah, if his arm length is above the 33-inch threshold, which I believe it will be, from everything I've heard, I think he's one of the safest picks in the draft, whether you're talking left tackle or guard.
Kat, you're talking one of the more safer picks at number 13. I started doing a little research here on Josh Simmons, and I'd love to get your thoughts on terms of the safety or the comfort of a pick like that, because this dude was an absolute stud at Ohio State. 0 pressures and 0 penalties through 5 games, but he suffered a season-ending knee injury, and it was his first season, I believe, playing left tackle. Solid right tackle in the past, but good start, but there's some unknowns there.
There are, and what a shame. He hurt his knee in Game 6 against Oregon. He was really trending to be a top 10 lock, and I think he would end up going in the top 5. To me, he's the most prototypical tackle in the draft when you talk about movement, you talk about size. And to me, if he gets back to 100%, he's the best fit for the Miami Dolphins. I mean, I think you can compare him very easily to Teron Armstead with how they move in space. But the other side of that, too, is there are 2 things going against him. Number 1, coming off the knee injury. And number 2, I think he's a poorer fit transitioning from tackle to guard because he's not quite as filled out as Membou or Kelvin Banks or even Will Campbell. So that's what kind of goes against him. But, I mean, if you're talking about at a premier position at either left tackle or right tackle, and he's played right tackle in his career, then you could really have a fantastic left tackle for the next 10 years if he returns back to form.
Where was he rated on your big board? Where's he listed? I'm sorry, I don't know.
I've got him at 5. So
5.
I've got Membou at 1, I've got Banks at 3, and I have Simmons at 5.
Wow.
Would you be upset taking? Sorry, Josh. I just want to ask.
Go ahead.
Would you be upset taking Simmons with either of those other 2 guys on the board?
No, I wouldn't. Upset, no. Would prefer the other 2 guys if they were still on the board. Really, anybody in my top 4, I'd obviously prefer. But if they looked at Simmons and said, we can make a guard out of him for a year and he's going to be our long-term either left tackle or right tackle, yeah, I would be very okay with the pick. I think Dolphins fans would be irate taking a left tackle coming off a knee injury, given what has happened with Teron Armstead.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, I don't think they're going to be scared off by the injuries based on their previous history. But, I mean, earlier you said Laramie Tunsil. Now you're sitting here saying Teron Armstead. How could – I mean, again, I'm kind of a fool when it comes to the offensive line. But just sitting here, I mean, I have no issue with any of these guys. If you can, move them inside for a year and then have your long-term answer on the outside. So, sign me up for Josh Simmons. His NFL comparison, according to Lance Zierlein, was DJ Humphrey. So, yeah, I mean, like you said, man, if he didn't get hurt, this guy could – been drafted much higher or even ranked much higher in a lot of these mock drafts and mock draft simulators that everybody loves to use.
The music to my ears, any prospect, and we know we're on the right track with the Dolphins. Can they climb? Can they reach the second level? Can they move in space? Those are the traits. Like, once you hear that, you're like, this guy could work for the Miami Dolphins. But Kat, 4 seasons at San Diego State. Is there a lot to take away from that time, that type of film? Or, like, is there a question, I guess I should ask, is there a question of if he's shown enough against, like, top-tier talent?
Simmons, I mean, you're talking about, 19 games for Ohio State in his career, somewhere around there. No, his if you start docking players for transferring in today's NIL type of world, then I think you're probably going to come away not liking anybody in the draft. Fair. So, no, I don't. I look at his time from San Diego State to now where he was at Ohio State before he got hurt, which is a shame, and think this is an ascending player and a great athlete at the tackle position.
All right, let's have the running back talk. Ashton Jeanty. Kat, what would this Miami Dolphins offense need to look like going into the draft for you to be happy with Jeanty? Because I think that's where this whole conversation needs to start.
I've got him 7th on my board, 7 out of 7. And other Dolphins fans would have him higher. I'll give you 2 schools of thought here. One is for the Dolphins to win anything meaningful in the next couple of years. You're not going to do it with Tua being better than Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, or Joe Burrow in the AFC. You've got to do something different. And that different could be that you get Ashton Jeanty and Devon Achane out on the field at the same time. Maybe that's the difference. And the same argument could be applied to Tyler Warren. But in terms of Ashton Jeanty, I mean, you're talking about somebody who, PFF and Lance Zierlein are pretty conservative with their comparisons. They don't want to overstate the player in their comparisons. Lance Zierlein compared him to LaDainian Tomlinson, and PFF compared him to Alvin Kamara. Tomlinson's a Hall of Famer, and Kamara's going to be. So that speaks pretty glowingly. You're talking about somebody with over 2,600 yards rushing this past year. And as a receiver, even though he didn't catch as many passes this year, I believe he has one drop over the last 2 years, and he caught a lot more passes in 2023. So if you're talking about somebody who you can pluck out of college football, put in your offense, and okay, this guy is going to be a major difference maker, Jeanty may be that guy. And the whole running back argument, I think, has changed. I mean, you look at Saquon Barkley to the Eagles. You look at Josh Jacobs to the Packers. You could give Derrick Henry to the Ravens. Those teams immediately got better because of the running back they picked up. So I wonder how much that changes the conversation this year.
Yeah, I mean, I was sitting here and I was thinking how, running back would certainly be a choice at 13, but I mean, I also had the same reasons as you. I mean, Devon Achane spoke, I believe it was with Kay Adams, what are you working on this all season? He was talking about route, learning the route tree and, doing those type of things. I mean, we keep hearing about how you could utilize him more in the not more, but utilize him a little bit in the passing game. I mean, bringing in a guy like Ashton Jeanty for a team, who you kind of need a bell cow, right? And this is a team that almost traded for, I know I said on previous pod, almost traded for Jonathan Taylor. They had very real interest in Jahmyr Gibbs, who clearly they would have had to draft, in the first round. So I don't think that you should be as scared off maybe as you would have been in the past, but thinking about what a guy from Boise State, and I don't know, could it be the dreads, his visor running around the blue field? I mean, it kind of reminds me of the JHI, again, that next tier, a Thunderstone JHI. I'd be okay with it. I think Jake and I, we love playing fantasy football. I don't know if you do, Cap, but I'd be picking up Ashton Jeanty in every freaking league if I could. But is that enough, right? Is that enough to fix things? I mean, you would obviously be getting guards in free agency and things like that. I mean, I'd be okay with it.
He's going to be one of the most interesting stories on draft day. And the question I would ask, it's like, if you're drafting a running back 13th overall, Mike McDaniel, what are you doing here? I mean, you're a running game coordinator. So that's an argument that would have to be had too. But
that's a good point.
Jeanty right now, I mean, you talk about the consensus big board. The top three guys that I took out, Abdul Carter, Travis Hunter, and Mason Graham. Number 4 on that list is Ashton Jeanty. So this is somebody who could go. His stock kind of reminds me of about 8 years ago when Zeke Elliott went 4th overall, where it's like, no, you can't draft a running back that high, and that was the common theme heading up into draft day. But then the Cowboys get up on the clock, and it's like, okay, we can pluck this guy out of college football, and he's going to add 2 or 3 wins to us. I think a lot of teams are going to have that temptation with Jeanty.
I mean, it's just so hard. You just start going through his stats. 267 yards in week 1. Yes, it was Georgia Southern, but it was also 267 yards, dude. That's truly insane. On the year, 374 carries, 29 total touchdowns, 23 receptions for 138 yards. But Cap, you start to fall in love with it. You look at that 2023 total, 43 receptions, 569 yards, and 5 touchdowns. That's a very capable back. I don't want to get too deep into it, but if you wanted to get real mad scientist and kind of have the debate, why would you draft Jeanty if Mike McDaniel is such a run-oriented mind? It's because you launched Tyreek Hill to the moon. That's where the Dolphins would be going real mad scientist. That's where I think this pick would make sense. But Kat, as I was doing research for all these different players, man, I think Tyler Warren on February 21st might be my favorite pick at number 13. And I'm starting to get a little queasy that he might be a Jet before we get that chance.
Yeah, you're not alone in that. And he's 4th on my board here. So I've got Membou 1, Will Johnson 2, Kelvin Banks 3, Tyler Warren 4, Josh Simmons 5, Jaylen Walker 6, Ashton Jeanty 7th. So, yeah, and talked about the consensus big board. Tyler Warren is 5th on that list. You're talking about someone who's 6'6", 261 pounds. is a legitimate inline blocking tight end, which is something sounds weird, but you don't see it a lot in these top tight end prospects. They're kind of detached from the line a lot. You look at these, tight ends picked this high before. Brock Bowers he blocked in line, but not as much as Tyler Warren. Kyle Pitts rarely did. But this guy, 6'6", 260, blocks in line, and someone who had 104 catches for over 1,200 yards last year. And of those 1,233 yards, 56% of them were after the catch. So the reason I don't have him as number one, I'd say if I had to really nitpick, is I don't see the same hip flexibility in him that I saw in Brock Bowers. And that's what I loved most about Brock Bowers is I thought he could come into the NFL and really separate immediately in every route. Now, I'm not saying Tyler Warren can't, but can he do it at an A-plus level like Brock Bowers can? That's where I have some hesitations of. But don't get it confused. He's still a fantastic prospect. And if he were a Dolphin at pick number 13, if he fell to the Dolphins at pick number 13, is it a good or a bad thing that you've got he and Geno Smith together? Because are you doubling down at that position, or are you going to really take the tight end position and do something other teams in the NFL aren't doing?
Man, that's a good question. I came on here before we jumped on here, and I even told Jake, I don't know that there's really a prospect that I'm, my heart's set on, but I think I'm with Jake with Tyler Warren, and we talked about on a previous pod. I mean, this dude's lining up at quarterback. He's lining up in the backfield. He's doing a little bit of everything, and then he's also helping in the run game. And I think, for as much as we sit here and talk about, drafting a tackle, maybe moving him inside, I think that you get just as much value almost. I mean, not long-term and things like that, but you get just as much value out of having Tyler Warren in that and adding him into the mix. I do think that what you mentioned, Kat, getting them both involved, him and Jonnu Smith, that could be a problem that they have. But Jonnu Smith, I think he only has 1 year left on his deal. I mean, hopefully the Dolphins extend him based off of what he did. But I think adding Tyler Warren, a true game-changing tight end, a guy who literally was almost Penn State's entire offense outside of that run game. I mean, sign me up for that. So that is where I think my heart's set right now. But again, I'd be okay with just about everybody that you mentioned.
Josh, you brought up the 40 snaps at quarterback in our community, 560 WQAM on YouTube. He was doing the tush push for him. So I think that, you consider what the Miami Dolphins are working with. I think that Jonnu Smith and Tyler Warren can be on the field together successfully. And I think if we want to see Mike McDaniel be that guy, look at the Patriots, like the Aaron Hernandez, Rob Gronkowski years, like different types of tight ends doing different types of things, where I think that Tyler Warren could be a unique piece for this offense. And I think when you start putting together more unique pieces, this is how this offense is going to change. It's no longer just speed. And I think that's so important. And Kat, you do make a great point, because this isn't a scenario where it's like, all right, if the Dolphins don't draft tight end, it's a need in free agency. It's not like you're going to be sitting there like, yes, the Dolphins need to go after Mike Gesicki, who people are calling the top tight end in the draft or in free agency, or Juwan Johnson. Those are kind of the two big guys. Those wouldn't be conversations we're having. So it's a different angle for someone like Tyler Warren. But man, I'm ready to try something new, try something different, break away from the speed, get some more playmaking ability in there that's not Durham Smythe, somebody who Kat, guess Durham Smythe's longest reception last year.
Oh, man. I'm going to say 17 yards.
8.
Oh, wow.
He did it 3 times, too. 3 receptions. So
Nice.
I think, man, get Tyler Warren in there.
Yes.
This is the red zone threat. Somebody who can block. Like, they've been trying so hard to make Julian Hill a thing, and I don't want to do more Julian Hill shade, but I think Tyler Warren could be someone to step in and be that guy. So it'd be thinking out of the box. I don't know if you'll last, but Kat, this has been an absolutely awesome list. Before we wrap up, you are doing a great job putting together a bunch of different big boards and kind of making a consensus board. I wanted to get some of your thoughts and maybe some things you've started to learn so far that kind of might have caught you off guard about this year's draft prospects.
As far as common themes are concerned, there are a lot of polarizing players in this draft. You look at the consensus big board. Ashton Jeanty is a running back at 4. Tyler Warren, a tight end at 5. Will Johnson at 6 is coming off a season-ending injury. Will Campbell at 7, a guy we haven't even talked about, who was barely off my list, and that would be, a lot of people would think that's crazy. I'm going to wait to see if he has 33-inch arms. I don't think he will. And if not, I I have bigger questions about whether or not his skill set allows him to be a dominant left guard or if he's going to be another Peter Skoronski. But, and then you look at like, you go down the list, like Jaylen Walker is somebody who is kind of a projection pick. So there are a lot of players that I think are going to be stars, but are also going to be swing and misses in this draft. That's kind of what I come away with here. But from the Dolphins' perspective, what is good is that, to me, you have 4 offensive tackles who can possibly play guard as well that are projected to go in the top 15 to 20 picks. So the Dolphins are really in that sweet spot as far as matching their need with best player available.
I wanted to ask your thoughts. I know it was on your list. Kenneth Grant. I mean, this is a guy who I started watching because I saw you mentioned. I mean, I watched him alongside Mason Graham, but when I went back and just kind of focused on him, I mean, this dude is a baller. He's swatting passes. He was absolutely, taking on double teams and things like that. I mean, it won't be the sexiest pick, but what would your thoughts be if Kenneth Grant was, the pick there at 13 for the Dolphins?
You guys are reading my mind because I know we did a top 7 board, but Will Campbell was 8, Kenneth Grant was 9. So I love him. He's 6'3", 340 pounds, and I'm interested to see if he has a Jordan Davis-like workout, which has been rumored. Maybe not quite running in the 4.7s, but you can see on the field, this guy is chasing down people from behind at 340 pounds. Now, PFF brought up a great point on their podcast where it's like, sometimes you just want to see the guy anchor for the entire game and use that 340 pounds that way, which is what the Dolphins need. Where it seems like right now he's kind of a 4-3 defensive tackle where he's trying to get into the backfield a lot more than he may need to. But overall, fantastic prospect. Whether he tests well athletically is going to determine whether he's a top 15 pick or falls into the second round.
Kat, you mentioned that I think your feeling or your perspective is that the Dolphins should be sitting at 13, not really playing shoots and ladders, and just take who's available. Let's say they don't do that, because I started to go through mock drafts, and I have a buddy who's a really big UNC fan, and Omarion Hampton is one name that I'm like, okay, Ashton Jeanty in the first round, it's too expensive, it's not going to happen. But how about someone like Hampton in the second round? And then lo and behold, I'm seeing him also going in the first round of these mock drafts. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on if this is going to be a draft where all of a sudden, you mentioned it earlier, the Josh Jacobs, the Derrick Henrys of the world, Saquon Barkley has started to change the perspective where we might see 2-3 running backs in the first round after a couple of years in the past where it was like, there's our first running back. It's round 3. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I think you've seen a lot more mock drafts this year that are willing to put an Omarion Hampton or a Caleb Johnson or a Travion Henderson in the first round. And I think that has to do with the success of the position last year in the NFL. Now, Omarion Hampton, back-to-back 1,500-plus yard seasons at UNC. And I was watching a lot of him the other day, and I couldn't quite put my finger on who he reminded me of. And then it hit me. He is exactly what I wanted Daniel Thomas to be, but he wasn't.
I love it. That's great.
And, I mean, you're talking about somebody who is a just no-nonsense, mean, giant runner who puts his leg in the ground, charges forward, and knocks over everything in sight. I think he is an unbelievably powerful back, but you can't underestimate his speed either. And for a big back, you kind of assume that they're not going to be able to catch the football. He might be the best receiving running back in this draft.
Man, that's interesting. I was going to kind of piggyback on that. But, if you don't get an Ashton Genty, you don't get a Tyler Warren, something like that. Where is the most value in this draft class? Where is, a position that maybe falls to the Dolphins and they're like, okay, this class is loaded. We don't need, X, Y, and Z.
Well, defensive tackle to me is the deepest. And for a team that needs needs guys to team with Zach Sealer, I mean, as far as players who could go in the top 3 rounds, who I could see as potential day one starts, you could go 14 or 15 deep here. I mean, so I think the consensus 13th best player that I've got listed is Ty Robinson from Nebraska, who's not a great athlete, but really is very similar to Zach Sealer, not quite as big, but somebody that, I could see him going to the Dolphins at the end of the 3rd round, and you get him on for cheap, and then, man, you plug him in there, and he's an above average starter pretty quickly. So there's that. There's also a guy named Jordan Phillips, believe it or not, from Maryland, who didn't have a sack last year, but is a really good nose tackle and one of the best ones in this draft. So if you're looking at that late third, fourth round area, a guy that you can get on the cheap and just hope for, defensive line is that position.
Kat, two names that have been linked to the Dolphins, Malachi Starks and guard Tyler Booker out of Alabama. I don't think either of them make sense at 13. I completely understand, like, the value just isn't there for, I mean, safety's been dwindling down in recent years. You'd rather get the cornerback. But if the Dolphins are moving around in the 20s, would you be comfortable, like, late first round with someone like one of those two guys? Like, even if it's pick 20, 21, somewhere in that range where it's not a stud position, not a huge playmaker, but, you know, like, we're going to pin someone in and they're going to be consistent. They're going to be even sound, dare I say, as a rookie.
Yeah, I've seen quite a few mock drafts have Booker and Starks or Starks projected to them at 13. And I understand why that's done. I mean, guard is arguably the biggest need on the team. For me, Tyler Booker is a great man scheme right guard or left guard. He played left guard at Alabama. And yeah, if you want to talk about a plug and play guy, then I think Booker is one of those guys. I don't think he's the best fit in Mike McDaniel's offense because of these converted tackles I've talked about here, he's probably the least nimble out of all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you trade it down to pick, let's say 25, you got a second round pick and a little bit more, and darn, Booker's still there. We didn't expect him to be there. I'd be more than happy with him being the pick, and I think he'd be a day one starter. Malachi Starks, best safety in the draft. Very fluid for 6'1", 205 pounds. Didn't make as many plays this past year for Georgia, which is a shame. But fantastic prospect. I don't think he has quite the upside to be a cornerback. I think he's either purely a safety or somebody that can move down into the slot, which does harm his value a little bit. So I see him going at the end of the first round along with Booker.
Yeah, I think that's actually where Daniel Jeremiah placed him too. And I think, you can understand the need, but I think you and I both kind of were agreeing on that, Kat. We watched, I think it was the Alabama game, and was it Ole Miss or something like that, and Malachi Starks didn't look the same. So I think a lot of people are putting that 2024 season maybe, faulting him a little bit too much for that. Tyler Booker, I think it was Travis Wingfield mentioned if the Dolphins were to draft a guard there, that'd be like 30 spots higher than anyone in the Shanahan tree has ever drafted a guard. And we all remember Mike McDaniel talking about how Tua was a point guard, and some personnel wanted to go out there and draft or get a guard or in free agency and this and that. And he said Tua needs playmakers. So I don't know that if the Dolphins were sitting there at 13, I mean, absolutely, if you trade down, I'd be all for a Booker or Malachi Starks. But at 13, I think that's a little bit too rich for the Dolphins. And I think a lot of people agree.
Wow. What an awesome podcast. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Josh. I have learned a bunch today. Everyone out there, thank you all so much for listening to Another Dolphins Podcast. If you're liking what you're listening to, I would tell you that we have shows coming out on 2 days. We don't know what 2 days they are every week. So the best way to know when a new show is out, 560 WQAM YouTube channel, wherever you get your podcasts, smash that subscribe button. Thank you all so much for listening to the show. We will be back next week, update some news and notes. But until then, go enjoy the weather. And most importantly, fins up.
Fins up.